we go. Okay, so my name is Sarah Tollok. I'll be the moderator for today's panel. I want to thank everyone for participating in 1455's second annual Summer Literary Festival. We hope you will help us spread awareness by sharing your impressions via social media, liking the 1455 Facebook page, and signing up for our newsletter. We also hope you'll dig deeper into the work of our authors. Their books are available for purchase via the links on the agenda page of the LitFest website. All purchases will be shipped directly to your door. 1455 is delighted to be partnering with the Potter's House on book sales this year. They're a nonprofit bookstore, cafe, and event space in Washington, D.C., with a very deep history of social justice and community building. Learn more about their work at www.pottershousedc.org. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our topic and panelists. And we want to make this panel as interactive as possible. So use the chat room to submit questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. So today's panel is fanfiction, the lit that asks, what if? That's the big thing. The most popular fanfiction site, Archive of Our Own, boasts under just 6 million fan works posted. So that's writings, artwork, videos. It has 2.5 million users and covers over 36,000 fandoms, and all of this content is offered for free. This is a creative movement that cannot be brushed under the rug as a fad. The creators of fan fiction do not fit into the media stereotype of teenage girls writing self-insertion stories based on their favorite boy band or teenage love triangle movie. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And they reflect a vast range of diversity and ability, called together by their love of the works that inspired them to answer the call of what if. The first person that I thought of for participating in this panel and who said an enthusiastic yes was Atlin Merrick. If you want to give a little wave, there she is. I came to know her from fanfics that she wrote for the Sherlock fandom. Atlin Merrick is acquisitions editor at Improbable Press, a genre fiction publisher that got its start by primarily publishing Sherlock Holmes pastiches before branching out into contemporary supernatural, adventure, and mystery, focusing especially on amplifying the voices of women, people of color, disabled people, LGBTQIA+, and more. In addition to being an extremely prolific and popular fan fiction author, Atlin has also written hundreds of articles, features, and essays, as well as 2 books, The Night They Met and The Day They Met, when written as Wendy C. Fries. She lives in Dublin by way of New York. Our next speaker, Lori, if you want to give a little wave. Lori Motomoto is an independent scholar of media fan cultures and a lecturer at the Department of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. She would have been in person in Winchester had circumstances been different. She is the symposium editor for the open access fan studies journal Transformative Works and Cultures, a co-organizer for the annual Fan Studies Network North American Conference, and she has authored numerous book chapters and journal articles on transcultural fandoms and circulation of Japanese media in non-Japanese fan cultures. She is an unrepentant proselytizer of the television show Hannibal and the webcomic Check Please, as well as an avid reader and occasional writer of fan fiction on the Hugo Award-winning Archive of Our Own. She once published an academic essay on Hannibal as transformative work, and she has co-authored an essay forthcoming on the semiotics of flower crowns in the Hannibal fandom. Last but certainly not least is Dr. Kavita Mudan Finn, which I'm not seeing in our video feed at the moment.
The arrow up at the top. Just
the arrow up at the top. Yeah, oh, I see. There she is. Okay. She is a medievalist, early modernist, and fan studies scholar who has published a book on 15th century queens entitled The Last Plantagenet Consorts, Gender, Genre, and Historiography, 1440 to 1627, as well as numerous articles and book chapters on a variety of topics ranging from Shakespeare to online fan culture to popular medievalism, and edited essay collections on children's literature, Shakespeare's Queens, Hannibal, and Game of Thrones. Everyone is on Twitter for ongoing conversation. We have a lot to talk about. when we met for a pre-panel Zoom meeting that we were supposed to talk for about 30 minutes. We ended up talking for an hour and a half because we are so passionate about these topics. So we have a lot to cover, and we'll try not to just gush about our individual fandoms for the next 60 minutes. It'll be hard. What I thought I'd like to start everyone off with is, how did you enter the world of fan fiction? And what role has it played in your personal life and your professional life?
Anybody in particular you want to start?
You can start. Go for it.
I was a writer. I've been a writer for about 25 years. Have always been in fandoms, but never wrote for them until roughly Sherlock. I did write before then, but didn't deeply dive until Sherlock in 2010. By then I'd been working as a writer for 15 years. And I just started writing the fic because there's always these questions not answered. And so here's what I think the answer is to this and to this and to this. And then I started writing what ifs, exactly. What if they met this way? What if they met this way? And that turned into my first book. And then different imaginings, what ifs they met other ways, turned into my second book. And basically that's where I am now. And then I ended up running the small press that spun off from my publisher's press. The one who published those books then spun off a Sherlock imprint. And we've since been purchased by an Australian company, but that's where I am.
Wonderful. Lori, you want to go next?
Oh.
Are we there?
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Sorry about that. So I've been a fan since I saw the real first Star Wars in 1977. So back from the dawn of prehistory, I've been a fan, but I honestly didn't know about online fan culture or fan fiction or anything until about 2000, when I took a course in graduate school on reception and spectatorship, and we talked about fandom and read Dr. Henry Jenkins's book called Textual Poachers, which is sort of a formative field work in the field of fan studies, and he talks extensively about fan fiction. And I was, at the time, deep in the throes of X-Files fandom. I was crazy about it, and I'm like, I wonder if there's X-Files fan fiction, which is fan fiction, right? It's like, that's a dumb question. Yes, there was X-Files fan fiction. And first I started reading it, and then I thought I could totally do this. And I'm sort of an off again, on again, off again, on again fan fiction writer, but I've been a religious reader pretty much since then.
And Kavita?
I guess it depends on how you define fan fiction. But let's see. The first one that I can specifically remember was when I was in 6th grade. So this would have been, I think, 1994 or 1995, maybe. I wrote a fix-it crossover fic for Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, where Sidney Carton was rescued by the Scarlet Pimpernel. And so it was very esoteric, especially for a 6th grader. But that I wrote it and I gave it to my 6th grade English teacher, and she apparently really liked it. So that was probably the first piece of fan fiction I wrote that I actually showed anybody else. A couple of years later, I discovered the internet and started hanging out in fandoms for Broadway musicals, most specifically The Phantom of the Opera, where good fanfic goes to die. Yeah, it was not a very, it was okay, especially for the age that I was at the time, but there was a lot of bad stuff out there, including what I was writing. Thankfully, I got better later on. So I have been writing fan fiction pretty much my entire life. And I have been reading it almost as long. I loved Arthurian retellings as a kid. I loved fairy tale retellings as a kid. So it really is, it's something I've been doing for my entire life. I didn't start studying it until after I finished graduate school. So now I study it and write it and read it. So it's a good
all
time.
around. Yeah.
Yep.
Fan fiction is described by Merriam-Webster as stories involving popular fictional characters that are written by fans and often posted on the internet. But as you kind of alluded to, Kavita, fan fiction has a long history that predates the internet. And so I'd like to kind of get a little bit of a history lesson for those that don't know as much about it. And also, so we talked about how it's very popular. You know, there's millions of works. Why are we discussing it at a literary festival? Why is that an important piece of kind of modern literature? So Kavita, I know you had, when we did our pre-panel discussion, you had a lot of insights about the history.
Well, there's that essay that I linked to you, which will eventually get put up on the Literary Festival's website. But the thing about fan fiction is that it is as old as literature itself. We call it fan fiction nowadays, but frankly, it's been around forever. As long as people have been telling stories. Someone told the first story, then someone presumably told a spin-off of that story, and we go on and on and on. It is commonplace in fan studies scholarship to talk about the Aeneid as Virgil writing fanfic of Homer, or Dante writing fanfic of Virgil, or any of the hundreds of Arthurian texts out there written between roughly 1100 and 1500 as works of fan fiction based on Geoffrey of Monmouth if you were in Western Europe. So it is a genre. If you want to look at it in its broadest sense, it has been around pretty much ever since storytelling has been around. It's a communal form of storytelling. And there are a couple of fan scholars who've really sort of delved into this idea of fan fiction. Abigail Dureco, Catherine Tosenberger, E.J. Nielsen, they all talk about these particular types of fan storytelling practices. Now, as far as more specific definitions of fan fiction, especially fan fiction nowadays, the time that changed was the invention of copyrights, which at least in Western Europe or in the Western world, you're looking at roughly sometime in the 18th century. I'm not sure. I mean, you can't put an exact date on it, but it's sometime in the 18th century. And after that, you start to see the development of a very different idea of authorship, which is the idea of the individual genius, who, let's say, more often than not is both white and male. So you end up with this idea that genius comes from within rather than as a communal kind of storytelling. So for instance, in my own field, I work on Shakespeare studies, among other things. And this is where the myth of Shakespeare developed. This idea of Shakespeare as this vessel into which genius was poured, and then he just spat it out in 37 plays and a bunch of very lovely poems. That is not how authorship worked in the early modern period. Shakespeare had collaborators. We are finally starting to acknowledge that now. And at least my pet theory is that his collaborations with his fellow playwrights like Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, John Fletcher, all of these other playwrights who were around at the same time may actually bear a closer resemblance to the kinds of conversations happening between fan writers and fan readers. That possibly collaboration, it could have been one playwright wrote one scene, one playwright wrote another scene, or it could be two playwrights who each picked up characters and each of them were talking to each other and they were sort of talking back and forth, which is the way a lot of collaborative fan works get written these days. Mm-hmm. So
make it twins.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Add some twins. When all else fails, add twins or pirates. So yeah, I mean, fan fiction has a long and storied history. And while I think we kind of take it for granted now that it has this long history, but that's why we're talking about it at a literary festival, because even though nowadays it's kind of pocketed into this specific subculture, it really isn't. It's everywhere. Just on Twitter the other day, I was reading about people complaining about this new Great Gatsby prequel that's coming out, which is apparently based on Nick, the most boring character in The Great Gatsby. And I had read maybe a month or so ago, about this forthcoming novel that's supposed to come out next year, which is based on Jordan, who is by far the most interesting character in The Great Gatsby. So I have been sort of putting some posts on Twitter, sort of pointing at that novel, even though it's not out yet, just because it's way more interesting than what's about to be published. So sad.
Before we get to, because you had started to bring up about copyright, and I think a lot of people who don't know a lot about the world of fan fiction probably have that question. How are you writing stuff and posting stuff about, and in some cases publishing things like in hard actual books that other people, about characters that are worlds that other people wrote. But it's funny, as you were talking about the books that are coming out that are spin-offs in a sense of The Great Gatsby, I keep picturing it on AO3, on Archive of Our Own, under like, so this is the prequel, or this is like the character study, because all the, and we'll talk, yes, an AU, the alternate universe, which everyone loves.
Yes.
And as people who aren't familiar with fan fiction are maybe watching this, we're going to be talking a lot about something called tags. So if you go onto Archive of Our Own, for fics have tags. So they'll give you a description of what characters, what the relationships are, kind of a general feel of that fic. So if you hear us talking about these things, that's where that's coming from. Maybe we'll have some time at the end to kind of do a rapid fire of our favorite tags. But getting back to the question of what are some of the legal copyright issues involved with producing fan fiction? And Atlin, I want you to kind of start with that, because you're publishing, and I own from your publishing company, fan fiction books.
Yes and no.
Yes.
Here's
and
the
no.
thing.
Yes.
If we're specifically talking about like Sherlock, 3/4 of those stories are in the public domain. You could spin off from any of those, and it's out of copyright. So those are your stories. Hence, and I have the list here. Hence, you have Peter Tonkin, David Shore, John le Carre, all these people who write their own Sherlocks. Okay, these are people who, from them, it's called homage or pastiche, or let's just call it white guy, because this is why. Well, this is why, you know, you get that sticky mouth thing of it's a pastiche, it's not fan fiction, because it's somehow legitimized, even though they're doing exactly what we're doing. The point is that it's not, these things aren't under copyright. And let's just say they were. You write your BBC Sherlock, running around London with his Watson, and there's Mrs. Hudson, and there's Molly, there's characters in there that are not from the canon. You're allowed to do that. You can do that and share that with your friends. You just can't make money doing it unless you remove those original characters that belong to somebody else, or let's just say they all belong to somebody else. You change their names. This is why David Shore, it's House MD, not Holmes MD. Wilson instead of Watson. You know, this is fan fiction with the serial numbers scrubbed off. Only he's admitted that this is Holmes and Watson. So that is the copyright issue. You can write all the fan fiction you like, just don't make money on it. And if you want to make money on it, you change it enough so that it's yours. Like a million other people have done, you know, like Kavita said, you know, retelling the legends and the fairy tales. You make it yours. It's your voice. This is every story ever written.
And Lori, you had talked about some of the international copyright things that happened when we had kind of a pre-panel discussion.
It's interesting because, you know, fan fiction in the United States, we generally talk about it as falling under the aegis of transformative works in the legal sense, and there's a sort of an extensive literature about this, but the case that sort of set out a definition of transformative works was Acuff Music versus someone I can't remember, possibly the state, I don't know. We'll find the link. But at any rate, the ruling on that case basically said, if you are transforming an existing piece of work, under copyright or not, for the purposes of, you know, telling a different story, critique, parody, I mean, there's an extensive list, then yeah, as Atlin was saying, it is not, it doesn't fall under our usual sort of intellectual property concerns. That said, this is obviously in the United States, and fan fiction, English language fan fiction culture is very much dominated by a sort of US perspective, but there are people around the world writing it, and depending on where you are, and I think how visible you are to copyright holders, there are sort of different ways of approaching this issue of making money from it. And so the other day when we were talking, an example that I brought up was, and I actually have a short readable essay on this that I can link to later, but this is a book from Japan. It's called John, it's something like John Goes to the Naked something, I'm not exactly sure. Naked is in there. But you'll notice that the John here is very much Martin Freeman's John Watson, and the Sherlock is very much Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock Holmes. This was written by sort of the preeminent translator of Sherlock Holmes stories, Arthur Conan Doyle stories in Japan. He is a huge and very well-known fan, but this is very much in the realm of fan fiction of the television show Sherlock. And it really, it's one of those sort of fly under the radar kinds of things. And one of the most interesting things about this to me is that it's a perfect wedding of Sherlock fan fiction, but also Anglo-American Sherlock fandom. And this is because the designer of the cover was actually a huge fan of the show. She was a manga artist. She passed away a few years ago. But before she did, she created this cover, and it's difficult. It's a little difficult to see, but if you look up here, you can make out an otter and a hedgehog, which are the fandom icons of John and Sherlock. And so this is this, you know, this perfect wedding of fandom and fan fiction and commerce, because this is a huge publisher. Hayakawa Shoten is one of the big Japanese publishers, and this was very much for money. And so, you know, the ways that we talk about fan fiction and copyright and monetization in the US don't necessarily hold for the rest of the world, even when those properties are, in this case, Anglo-American or British properties.
So we kind of talked about the history, and that this isn't just a recent thing. This isn't a flash in the pan thing. But in the media, there are a lot of stereotypes about people who write fan fiction, people who are maybe like very into fandoms. I see Atlin warming up. So what are some of the myths that you all would like to dispel? Jump in, Atlin, go for it.
First off, who is creating these myths? Who is no doubt denigrating? It will always be someone who is already catered to, someone who already has their tastes absolutely filled. 30 stories about a white superhero here, 30 stories about a loner cop there, 30 stories, and so on. And all populated by a buxom girl who you know, fawns over this not very interesting guy half the time, right? So these are generally the people I have found are telling you who writes fan fiction and why they write it. So basically, I think ignore anyone who's telling you, unless it happens to be the person or people you know who are actually doing it. Because, you know, are you going to go to somebody who is a farmer and say, tell me what diseases I'm going to probably get when I'm 50. No, you're going to go to a doctor. What can I expect for my health as I hit 50? You're not going to go to a farmer. So why are you going to go to some middle-aged white guy and say, who writes fan fiction? Why on earth would they do it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, so.
Yeah, the gatekeepers.
Yes. Oh gosh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Would anyone else like to ring in on that?
I would.
Go for it.
I promised in our pre-discussion that I would not bring up the subject of Hannibal, and I lied. So, but the reason I want to bring it up, there's a reason to sort of pick up where Atlin left off. This is really the case with a lot of television showrunners. You know, we're in the age of so-called prestige TV, and we define that by it not being, you know, soap opera, basically. It's sort of, you know, there's good television and then there's, you know, melodramatic crap, as in reality TV, but that's not today's problem. And a lot of fan fiction is actually based on these prestige shows. And there too, and we see this with filmmakers as well as television showrunners, we have men coming in and saying, you know, oh, well, this is my fan fiction. Stephen Moffat with Sherlock, with Doctor Who, was sort of famous for kind of throwing around the word fan fiction, and at the same time really kind of having a interestingly difficult relationship with women fans. So to bring in Hannibal, Bryan Fuller, the showrunner for that, is also one of these people who said that Hannibal is fan fiction. The difference being that Hannibal actually is fan fiction, and it works very much within the same legal constraints, you know, to pick up from what we were talking about, that that fan fiction works within. They famously did not have the rights to any of the characters that were introduced in Thomas Harris's Silence of the Lambs, which includes Clarice Starling. And so there is not one, you know, there's no peep about this person named Clarice Starling. There is no peep about this person named Buffalo Bill. But there is absolutely poaching from the text of Silence of the Lambs for dialogue. In particular, is primarily dialogue parceled out to whoever he felt like, because this was one of the great kind of, as far as I'm concerned, what if media texts. And in fact, at one point in the third and last season, one of the protagonists actually says, you know, what if everything was different? What if we hadn't done this? And the character he's talking to says, you know, in another world? And he says, yeah, in another world. And it plays throughout with this idea of what if. But I believe it does it in part to get to this issue of how fangirls and fan fiction readers and writers are characterized. I think it's able to do that because it has largely abandoned what Kavita was talking about, this notion of sort of the lone genius, creator, author, and this was going somewhere, but it exhibits, it doesn't spend any time as shows are sometimes want to do, ranging from Sherlock to Supernatural to The X-Files. The list goes on. There are things that I don't even know about. You know, people enjoy kind of going after fangirls, and Judith Fathala actually has written quite a bit on this. Hannibal is one of those rare texts that really doesn't. And in fact, you know, Bryan Fuller has been quoted as saying, you know, I write my fan fiction and then I put it out in the world and the fans write their fan fiction. And it's this wonderful communal activity. And I think that's, you know, especially since that's part of our current media environment, that's one of the reasons why fan fiction is so important to be talking about.
Mm-hmm. We had a great question come in the chat from Deborah Diner. It's one of my coworkers. She's wonderful. And she said, I love your point that fan fiction and homage are really one and the same. The term fanfic is so often used, like you were just saying, Lori, in a dismissive way. Would you rather more things, for example, if it was House, be labeled with the term fanfic? Or would you rather fanfic be given higher labels like homage or allusion? So it's kind of in
Can
the—
I answer this one?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I think there's a couple of different things going on. I feel like there is a desire on the part of some fan scholars to say that just everything is fan fiction. All of these things are fan fiction. I actually want to push against that a little bit, because I feel like there is a particular community aspect to fan fiction that doesn't quite translate when you're looking at something like an homage or an allusion. I think that they're all related. I think that there's a blanket term, say transformative work, that encompasses all of these things. But a lot of it is about how you're speaking to your audience and how your audience is interacting with you. It's about a relationship that's built between the writer and the reader, the writer and the audience, depending on whether you're reading a fanfic or looking at a piece of fan art or listening to a podfic or what have you. There is a sense, and I think this actually is related to what we were talking about, what you were mentioning earlier about tags and tagging and archival practice. Because when, hypothetically, if you are going on Archive of Our Own and you are going to look for a particular piece of fan fiction, there are a number of ways that you can find it. You can search by character, you can search by fandom, you can search by pairing if you want just romantic or just friendship or what have you. You can search by tag or by trope. If what you want to read is something incredibly gritty and dark, you can find that. If you want to read a coffee shop AU where everything is rainbows and puppies, you can find that. And everything in between. Even if you want to read some sort of incredibly obscure, ridiculous crossover, 9 times out of 10 you can find it. Whether you'll regret what you find is an entirely different story, but you can find it. So I think, so while I can understand the desire to sort of, I guess, legitimize fan fiction by saying, oh, everything is fan fiction, I want to push against that, just because I think that fan fiction is doing something different than a lot of these homages are. And I do agree with all of what Lori was saying about this idea of I believe the term is fanboy auteur. Is that is that what they're calling themselves lately?
Yeah, that's Suzanne Scott's term.
Fanboy auteur. Yes, that is a thing, and it's insufferable. But that I think the difference is that they see themselves as doing they see themselves as working within sort of creating a different relationship with their audience. I recently rewatched Quentin Tarantino's film *Inglourious Bastards* a couple of weeks ago. It is easily my favorite of all of Tarantino's films, at least in part because it is unashamedly a fan film. It is an AU for World War II. It is completely insane. He is lifting bits of music from other movies. He's creating scenes based on other directors, based on like other scenes explicitly lifted from other movies. It's fantastic, but it is a work of fan fiction. And Quentin Tarantino probably does not think so, but it is. And I think that he just sort of embraced it. He ran with it, and you can kind of see it in the way that the actors are performing on the screen, and you can see it in the way that the film works. And so I think that there's a lot going on, and I think that that fan fiction creates a certain relationship, and that's why we should sort of keep the terms a little bit separate.
Can I jump in on that real quick? I think one of the things that I think, Kavita is getting at is, I agree completely, is sort of that relationship of the fan fiction creator, whether it's in, a visual format, whether it's written and so on, with the material. A lot of time, it's just an example. I'm not telling everybody you need to watch Hannibal, but you do. But to sort of use that as an example, the showrunner has said this is it's kind of like a weird, 80s, 90s art film kind of thing. But to me, the difference between that show and others that are similarly sort of cinematic in their sensibility. You know, they kind of obliquely reference other films, you know, I don't know, pick a French filmmaker and there's something in there kind of thing. They tend to use those in this kind of prestige television. They tend to use those sorts of cinematic allusions or literary allusions, what have you, as kind of Easter eggs, as little presents for the uniquely, you know, attuned audience. They're rewards for, you know, knowing this kind of esoteric thing. In the case of Tarantino, and this is also true, this kind of fanboy approach to filmmaking is also true of things like Kill Bill. And in Hannibal as well, it's much more of a, did you see what I did? And the excitement is there. I mean, and Quentin Tarantino is notorious for being very excited about everything that he loves. But the relationship is singularly affective, it's emotional. And I think that is, as Kavita is talking to, I think that is arguably the biggest thing that distinguishes sort of pastiche, homage, from fan fiction, is that love of what you're talking about, that absolutely unabashed, did you see what I did? You know, and Brian Fuller with Hannibal, you know, one of the things that he did throughout the screening of the show was he live tweeted on 2 coasts every episode. And when something that they had put in as an allusion to something else showed up, he was the first one in all caps, you know, tweeting, did you see that? Did you see that? I had to fight to get the right to use that picture, kind of thing. You know, he wanted everybody to see it because he was really excited for it to be there. And I think that is the difference, is that we love what we're reading and writing with a kind of unapologetic passion. And it's that sort of unapologetic passion, I think, that is at the heart of these negative characterizations of fan fiction, fangirls, and so on. We, as a society, we are really uncomfortable with people having emotions, but especially positive ones. And, you know, when these girls show up and we are excited to see the thing, you know, there it is, and I'm going to wait here all night if I have to see, you know, whatever I want to see. People, you know, they turn off to that. It's not serious. It's not a good use of your time. It's, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in quickly and just to say that I agree with everything Laurie is saying, and I think it's great. I just do want to add that this doesn't mean that fans are uncritical, because that is one of the things that people like to say about fans, is that they're completely uncritical. You just swallow everything that whatever media creator gives you and you don't question it. That is absolutely not true. And that I think, yeah, I am too going to go down the Hannibal route and use it as an example, just because it's a great example. Because Hannibal manages to be both incredibly fanish about the source text, but also very critical of it. There are a lot of really awful things in Thomas Harris's books, and most of them do not make it into the show. They are cut out, they are changed, they are transformed, as Laurie writes about in a chapter that appeared in a book I edited last year called Becoming. Highly recommend it, very good book. So that is one of, I think, the stereotypes that pops up about fans, is that they are uncritical. The fact is that is not true. Fans are critical because they love a text. It is a criticism that is rooted in love. That is what I like to tell my students when they ask about it. And the reason that they critique it is because they love it and they want it to be better. I say this as someone who hangs out in what I like to call the blasted crater of the Game of Thrones fandom. We're still here. We're just fans of the books now. Or some of us were all along. I have been there since 2002. Pray for me. So yeah, it's so I'll pass it on to Atlin then.
Well, I just want to add that they're in some ways very, very chiefly critical, because so much of what we are fans of is very white, and it's very male, and it's very, you know, Eurocentric and
heterosexual,
straight. And straight, yeah. So we invariably are approaching it to add the things that aren't there. You know, whether that's like 3 Black characters, or someone who has a disability, or just, you know, a woman who has a reason to be there that isn't attached to the hero. You know, very critical. This is what fan fiction that I'm reading is all about. It's highly critical, but we like a lot of things, so we'll bring those things in while adding all the very many things that are missing. And there are very many things that are missing.
Mm-hmm.
There's just to mention a fan fiction that's included in Francesca Coppa's anthology of fan fiction, which is an invaluable resource if you teach this at all, which is called the Fan Fiction Reader, I believe. And she included a story that I cannot remember the title of offhand, but I will find it and we can link to it, that is focused on the legend of the character of Finn in the most recent Star Wars trilogy, as the stormtrooper who left. And Finn himself barely makes it into the story, but it's very much a focus, you know, it's very much drawing attention to his character's uniqueness and the ancillary effects of that. And so it starts from Star Wars and then takes it in a completely different direction in a very sort of inherently critical way. So if you're looking for a good story.
Well, it's a what if. Okay,
Yeah.
what if a stormtrooper, yeah, you know.
I think all of that, you go ahead, Atlin, go ahead.
I just wanted to add to what Lori said, that she kept saying it was about love, it was about love, it was about love. And it's about love to me as manifest joy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, yeah, look what I did. And then here comes like the beautiful giving circle. I wrote a thing. Somebody made art of the thing.
Yeah.
Oh my God, somebody podficked the thing. Somebody made art again, and then you get inspired by the art that was inspired by the podfic, which was inspired by the art, which was inspired by your story. So you have this endless circle of joy in fan fiction. Someone is always creating something that inspires somebody else to create something. So it's like fan fiction of fan fiction, but it's just this like delicious circle where everyone's happy. You know, generally speaking.
I have to myself fangirl a little bit about Atlin as a fanfic writer. She was one of the first people that I started reading when I started reading Sherlock. And I think you just embody that persona that you were just describing, that enthusiasm and that generosity that I think is a big part of fandom. And yeah, I mean, it's because I would, you know, write all these comments. You can comment on someone's work on Archive of Our Own, and then Atlin will write back every time. And, and that for me was something new. And then when I started writing, because so many of us, as we're writing, you know, your book or whatever, for a while, there goes my pod, you're kind of writing into that void. You know, it's yourself at your computer. But when it comes to fanfic, if you post a chapter every few days, you are getting constant feedback, and like some of it's just people just, you know, finger smashing on the keyboard. Oh my gosh, this is so good. Or like people telling you what parts made you cry, what made them cry. It is, it's such a high, you know, as you're going along and you're getting this feedback as you're writing. So yeah, so I just had to do that for a moment and just sing your praises. But I want to loop back around to what a lot of you were saying about making how a lot of marginalized groups have found that community in fandom by making a place for yourself in works that don't always have that representation. And very rarely have that representation. Or they touch on it, or they'll put a toe in it and then they back off, you know, and you're like, no, let's just jump in. Yeah, let's just go for it. And so, yeah, so why do we think so many members of marginalized groups of people have found ways to express themselves through and find themselves in? And I know when we were in FanWorks, and I know when we were doing our discussion last week, I know, Kavita, you were talking about you had a personal story with that, and I think Lori, you did as well. Just want to kind of throw that out there. I don't know who.
Not my dog.
No.
Okay, I think they're muted now. Okay.
One of the things that I did want to bring up, and that actually relates to what Lori was talking about with the Finn story, and I'll use Star Wars as an example because it's the one that that immediately comes to mind. We do love to celebrate fandom for its diversity and its multicultural inclusion, which to a large extent, yes, that is absolutely true. But there are sometimes issues that do crop up. And we do have to address these issues both within Fanish communities and within fan studies as a discipline. And some of the scholars who are talking about that right now, the two that immediately come to mind are Zina Hutton and Rukmini Pandey, also Samira Nadkarni. They're all talking about some of the issues with race and racism in fandom. And they mirror some of the issues that we are having basically everywhere in terms of Anglo-American conversations on these topics. So I mean, it's the elephant in the room. I do want to bring it out there because it is out there. But it is true that overall, these kinds of fan communities are a good place for people to find themselves in texts that do not otherwise include them. Could we do better in terms of encouraging those writers? Yes, we absolutely could. But that space does exist, and we are working to make it more inclusive.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I have noticed. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I have noticed that small presses are try and do this a lot. You know, they specifically ask for LGBTQIA+ people. They specifically want a variety of voices. So I'm always encouraging anyone who's a new writer, look at small presses. Yes, maybe you want Penguin or Random House. Look at small presses. They are much more likely to want your voice than the bigger ones. Sorry, go ahead, Lori.
No, absolutely, I agree, and I want to sort of co-sign on what Kavita says, which is absolutely the case. I agree 100%. And we in fan fiction as well as fan studies, because fan studies actually, in not insignificant ways, is in some ways sort of a descendant of fan fiction culture. At least in certain ways of thinking about it. We've generally been a pretty welcoming space for non-straight cultures, for women of every kind. And as Kavita says, race is sort of, it's the elephant in the room. It's the one that we are nervous about talking about, because fan fiction culture, and this is actually, although it's a self-selecting survey, the podcast Fansplaining, which I highly recommend, if you'd like to know more about this stuff or just hear it talked about intelligently. They did a survey a while back asking, sort of demographic questions about fan fiction reading, favorite kinds of story, all sorts of things. But one of the things, and again, self-selecting, but they had a very large response. And it became sort of overwhelmingly clear that fan fiction culture, as we know it right now, is overwhelmingly white. And as a result, I think we are very much in the middle of grappling with as Kavita says, the same kinds of issues as we are, particularly in the United States, but elsewhere as well, with, race and diversity and racism in all of its forms. But I did want to mention briefly, you know, to talk about one other group that seldom gets talked about, and perhaps because people think they're being polite, I don't know, but that is the Fat Girl Contingent. If you have ever been to a fan convention, you will notice that a lot of participants, whether they identify as female or not, they are fat. I am fat. And fan fiction culture, I think, is in some ways uniquely welcoming to fat people, in part because, and this is especially online fan fiction culture, but it predates it, in part because it is a sort of distance-based culture. We don't have to be embodied in the same ways that we are in everyday society. If I want to write a beautiful story, if I want to write a beautiful story, I got to look somewhere else. But if I want to write a beautiful story about two characters that I love, I can write it and people will praise me for it if it's as beautiful as I hope, without thinking once about how I look, because that does not matter. I don't have to show myself. And it is in some ways, you know, it is, I suppose, a way of kind of hiding out, but it also can be, and again, it may not be affirmative. We do have this sort of propensity in fan fiction cultures to aestheticize, fetishize, you know, thin white men, based on thin white male actors a lot of times. But to just give an example of something that I found really interesting, fan fiction for the recent Amazon Prime show Good Omens, the show based on Neil Gaiman's novel, featured Michael Sheen in a role in which he was a bit pudgy. Now this is a bit pudgy next to David Tennant, you know, I mean, a stick would be a bit pudgy next to David Tennant, right? But here's Michael Sheen. And in fact, at some interview, they actually said, they asked him if he had put on weight for the role. He was like, no. And I guess that was the end of that interview. But, you know, he's bigger than David Tennant. And so in fandom, in fan art and in fan fiction based on the show, his character, Aziraphale, has become this kind of icon of pudgy beauty. He is uniformly described as soft and lovely, and you can sink into him, and he's wonderful to hold, and that kind of thing is, I think, the kinds of acceptance that you, Sarah, that you're kind of getting at when you ask that question. Sorry, our door, somebody's at our door. Somebody else will get it. That can kind of arise sort of out of seemingly nowhere, that, you know, suddenly from in the distance, you know, I find this one character and that's my character, you know, that's the one I'm going to latch onto. That's who I identify with. And if it happens to be in the form of Michael Sheen, oh, well, you know, more's the pity. He's so cute. Anyway, sorry, I'll let that go.
Before we go on, because I know we're nearing the end, not at the end. I just wanted to remind all those who are viewing, if you have a question for the panel, you can submit it by clicking on the Q&A icon and submit one at any time. And so I know someone had asked one in the chat earlier, but they're saying to use the Q&A icon, which I have open and I will see it. I think we have hit on a lot of like the major topics that we wanted. So now it's just like free for all. And, or maybe that chat about the tags that are used and our favorites that we seek out. One thing that I think we had talked about last week, and we had touched on today too, is when you are searching out a fic, as opposed to maybe a book. By just reading the book jacket, you're going to get a feel for the plot. Maybe if it's like a generally suspenseful or a thriller or horrific or whatever. But you can chase a mood when you're looking through fanfic tags. So you can get the the angst, but with the happy ending, you know, and you know what you're going to get. Or you can say, I think someone had said earlier, like the fluffy coffee house AU, where and of course the ones where for a lot of the shows or books that a lot of people die, one of the tags is everybody lives. We don't have to worry about that. I think, Kavita, you had said during last week's discussion that this had something to do with, it was related to Shakespeare's playbills, that he would give you all the spoilers and it's going to be happy or it's going to be tragic.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is generic convention, because you look at sort of a book jacket nowadays. It'll give you the barest outlines of the plot. You might get one or two character sketches, but they always try and avoid giving away the ending. This did not used to be the case. It used to be that, for instance, the playbill for Romeo and Juliet gives away absolutely everything, you know. And I mean, if anyone has read the prologue to Romeo and Juliet or heard the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, they give away the entire plot. We know what's going to happen. It's not a surprise. What's a surprise is that halfway through the play, it's good enough that you forget that that's what's going to happen. That's the mark of a good play. That's the mark of a good fanfic, is when you already know what's going to happen at the end, but halfway through you are genuinely worried that something is going to go awry. And that works for any genre. That works for any type of story. And it's interesting that nowadays people who are producing media are so scared of spoilers that they tie themselves in knots to try to avoid them, when really all they need to do is write a good enough story that your audience isn't going to care that they already know the ending. That's why I still hold out hope for Game of Thrones fandom in the long run, provided, of course, George R.R. Martin is able to finish the books. Because even if we kind of have a sense of where the whole thing is going to turn up, I at least feel that he will be able to produce an ending that will satisfy people, unlike certain people who will not be named. So I think that is really a much better benchmark for storytelling success, if your audience can already guess what's going to happen, but they care anyway.
Yeah.
I do want to flip to, I have two questions waiting for us. And this, I think, kind of touches on that. You try not to alienate people within the fandom, but stuff happens. This is from Rebecca. She said, I wondered if any of the panelists have thoughts about fandom migration across platforms online and how that affects fanfic culture and creation, especially as other literary forms arguably aren't impacted by this phenomenon. The need to up sticks and move away from platforms that become too hostile. So that migration from things got really hostile over here, I'm looking for a new platform to participate in.
I have thoughts.
Yeah, thoughts. What are your thoughts?
I'll do my thoughts quickly. If this is the Rebecca that I know, hey Rebecca. If it's not, then hi Rebecca. I do. Online fan fiction culture has gone through really interesting sort of waves, if you will, and those are largely platform based. And so it started out on, things like bulletin boards and listservs, and it moved to things like Yahoo groups, which is where I fell into it, where people would post their stories directly into the group, and occasionally there would be, sort of a fandom specific archive in X-Files fan fiction. It was called Gossamer. And then, there was sort of this gradual move on to LiveJournal, which for reasons that we can link to, became an inhospitable place for a lot of the kinds of fan fiction that were being created. And we saw another wave move on to Tumblr, but with each, and now we kind of have a more Twitter-based, in some ways. Wattpad, obviously, AO3 has become its own, Archive of Our Own has become its own sort of culture as well. But with each one, we're kind of bringing along some of the baggage of the past, but having to adapt to what it is that the platforms make possible for us, what affordances they allow. And, you know, I think in thinking of the question of platforms, one of the things to keep sort of in the forefront is that at the end of the day, people who write fan fiction and read fan fiction want to keep engaged with the story and the characters. That's the drive. And each platform affords different ways of doing that. And I think it's in those affordances what a platform enables, but also, you know, both in the positive and the negative sense. So, you know, we were talking about tagging a little bit earlier. On Tumblr, tagging actually became quite contentious and difficult issue because some people were what we call trolling the tags. They were using the tags to post screeds, images, and so on that were antithetical to the purpose of the tag, that were, you know, sort of actually seeking out conflict and that sort of thing. You know, in the same way we've had Zoom bombing more recently. You know, these affordances that allow us on different platforms to do different things allow us on different platforms to do different things, and not all of those are positive. But I think that that notion of affordances is how the different platforms sort of make themselves felt within changing fan fiction cultural norms.
Go ahead, Atlin. Did you want to say something?
No, I just was I was hoping you were gonna get to the last question.
Yes,
I know
I'm there. I am there, and I know you're bursting. If you're writing fanfic, how do you best deal with someone dismissive that you're not a real writer?
I'll ask, does anybody else want to talk about that?
I mean, I would just respond with just the very basic response: writers write. If you write, then you are a writer. It doesn't matter what it is that you're writing. Does it matter? I mean, it may matter to you. You define your relationship to your writing. If you want to just write for a fan community, that's great. Good for you. Do it. If you want to use fan fiction as a stepping stone to trying to write professionally, do that too. That's great. The great thing about fan communities is that they are open to writers of all genres and writers of all persuasions. Everyone from the teenager who's just starting out trying to learn how to write and doing self-insert fanfic, yes, that was me, all the way up to professional writers who still write fanfic because it's fun.
Yes.
I mean, yeah, that's why people are there. It's there because it's a great community. It's there because it's fun, and it's there because you get an audience and you get feedback. You can speak into the void, and the void will actually say things back to you sometimes.
And you have to ask who decides. You know, I don't function well with writers groups, but I was in one once with somebody who has been writing the same chapter of her historical novel. She'd been writing the same chapter for 7 years. Now, I'm sure she calls herself a writer. I have written 1 million words of fan fiction, 2 books, tons of essays in that same amount of time. She would probably call herself a writer and me not a writer. I think I'm a writer. I would call me a writer. And that's really what it comes down to. Do I feel like a writer? I mean, I know there's imposter syndrome and all that kind of stuff, and that's tough. But a writer writes. As Kavita said, a writer writes. You know, in a perfect world, if they want to get paid for it, they do. But to be a writer, you must write. That's all. And that's real.
I don't see any more questions. Does anyone have anything else to add? Because if not, I think that's a beautiful place to end, is talking about how that is the essence of it. If it's something that is going on to, you could hold in your hands and people pay money for it, or if it is you posting it at midnight on Archive of Our Own and never getting paid for it, and maybe 4 people read it. It's still that you wrote it, you created it, you added to the passion for it. And that's the whole movement. And that's why we're talking about it today as an important thing that is out there in the literary world. But does anyone have any kind of closing thoughts or anything that you'd like to say?
Can we run through our tags?
Absolutely. What are your favorite tags, Lori?
My favorite tags, I swear to God, my favorite tags are mutual pining, which is when, you know, two characters love each other so much and they just don't know it. It's so wonderful. And you can drag that stuff out forever. And, oh God, mutual pining. Right now I am on such a jag. But I do want to say, this is my last thing about Hannibal, but the most popular tag in Hannibal fan fiction remains, and I kid you not, and this is a real tag, cannibalism and fluff. And that is fan fiction culture for you. So.
Perfect.
Oh. Well, and you have to be in it to understand what people mean. But like with Hannibal and with like Star Wars, with Kylux, you know, General Hux and Kylo Ren, murder boyfriends. That's almost like saying, you know, cannibal fluff. You know, they're murder boyfriends, and, you know, probably there's not a lot of murder going on, but that is what they are. They are, you know, dark people doing fluffy things right now.
In Hannibal fandom, murder husbands is canonical.
Murder husbands, there you go.
Right there. It's right there.
Actually made it into
on the show,
show.
season 3.
Sorry, yours?
Yeah. Well, my favorite tags, prequels. I'm a sucker for them. I don't care if I already know the ending. In fact, that makes it better if I already know the ending. Because if a writer is able to make an ending new for me, then that's a mark of a good writer as far as I'm concerned. But I'm going to contradict myself immediately and also say canon divergence AUs, because I also love when a writer takes one tiny little thing and changes it, and you end up with a completely different story. And I have in fact just introduced my 4-year-old daughter to canon divergence AUs by way of the movie Frozen. So she and I are discussing in great detail an AU where there is no villain in the movie Frozen, and Prince Hans is actually a nice guy. So we'll see what happens.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say she shall be a professor in what, 30 years, 28 years? Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
I started out, I think, really getting into fan fiction in the Torchwood fandom. And my favorite character was killed off. So I'm sorry, I'm moving rooms because we're at a vacation rental. My family's coming back. But I like the Everybody Lives one. So it's the same, and you get to go on adventures, but the people who died in season 2 and the people who died in season 3 are still there, and they're still having fun and adventures together. And sometimes, you know, when life is stressful, you just want the fluff. And we had talked a little bit about the fluff, but I like they're all just having a dinner party, you know. Just none of the stress that's usually going on, and you just get that the fun banter and the little things, you know. But AUs are also fun. Coffee shops, bookstores, space, whatever. Put them someplace else and let's see what happens.
Yeah. With after Sherlock exploded, I ended up just falling into the Star Wars fandom, the sequel trilogies, and those you kind of but you really should probably move them somewhere else, because none of us know what it's like to be on a spaceship, and we can do that. But I like the AUs, the coffee shops, the bookstores, the architectural firms, the all of this, where you take those same two characters, a general and a, you know, hocus pocus religious magician, basically, and you say, well, here's what that would look like, you know, at you know, in a coffee shop or whatever. So those right now are like tags I really like. Plus, let us talk about this elephant in the room: tags for kinks. Holy, this is what tags are about for me, because once you find your fandom, you got to drill down. Do you like MPreg? Do you like, you know, family? I don't know. Do you like I don't know how deep I should go, but I like to look at the kink tags very much so.
Mm-hmm. And
yeah, we have to finish, but Regency, yeah. That's all.
I think we're being told we need to wrap up.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So thank you, everyone of my panelists, so much. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate it so much. And also thank you, attendees, for joining us today. Remember, all the programming is free, so attend any and all of the other panels of your choosing. And we'll be putting each of the video sessions on our website. We'll be sending out e-surveys after the event, 1455 will, so we'll welcome your feedback. And finally, while 1455 has endeavored to make this entire event free to everyone, it's not free to produce. If you like what you're experiencing, want to help subsidize this in future events, please consider a tax-deductible donation via 1455litarts.org. Every penny will help 1455 continue providing awesome, inclusive, and free programs.